When white announces an Italian game with bishop to c4, black may be hesitant to respond with knight f6, a strong and dynamic choice, but this does invite sharp, at times chaotic play after knight g5. With this in mind, black may prefer the solid alternative bishop to c5, activating the dark squared bishop without allowing a quick knight g5. This move welcomes a more tranquil opening experience. This may be the case if white decides to play a slower Italian game with d3. But in addition to the sharper Italian with c3, preparing central expansion with d4, white can try to set the board on fire with b4, confronting the dark squared bishop, turning the game into the Evans Gambit. Sacrificing the b-pawn may appear quite strange at first glance, so what is the idea after black simply accepts the pawn? Well, in the Evans Gambit, white sacrifices a pawn to attract an enemy piece on b4, preparing to gain a tempo against that piece, followed by striking in the center with d4. White prepares to build a strong two-pawn center starting with c3. And if the bishop returns to its preferred diagonal with bishop c5, white energetically strikes in the center with d4, setting the stage for a typical Evans Gambit struggle. Let's remove the pieces for a moment and check out the typical pawn structure. This is a typical Evans Gambit pawn structure that helps us better understand the ideas for both sides. White has sacrificed a pawn for an attack, which if unsuccessful can prove to be a long-term problem. The a2 pawn is isolated, and since white plays b4, the signature gambit in the Evans, it inevitably strikes in the center with d4. Notice this leaves the c3 pawn behind, so this is a backward pawn that may prove vulnerable later in the game. Now white certainly isn't trying to gambit a pawn just to enter a miserable endgame. If white is able to maintain two pawns in the center, white enjoys a serious central space advantage. This may prove problematic for black's minor pieces trying to actively enter the game. This structure also allows white to create a quick attack against the sensitive f7 pawn with bishop c4 and creating a dangerous queen-bishop battery with queen b3, pointing at the target on f7. Sacrificing a b-pawn also opens up the b-file for white's pieces, so this means that white's major pieces such as the queen and possibly a rook will add pressure down the b-file against black's queen side. This sets the stage for a sharp struggle as white will focus on building a dangerous opening initiative before black is able to comfortably complete development. Let's return the pieces to the board and see this sharp struggle in action. When we introduced the Evans Gambit, we captured the pawn with the bishop, which is by far the most popular choice. In fact, we'll spend a majority of the video discussing this key idea. If you're looking for a way to avoid some of the complications in the Evans, and you just want to reach a playable middle game without too much memorization or drama involved, then you'll definitely want to check out the Evans Gambit declined with bishop b6, which is a solid choice we'll discuss later in the video. After capturing the pawn with the bishop, followed by c3, we're going to spend quite a bit of time discussing bishop c5 when white is ready to expand in the center with d4. This may come as quite a surprise, but this is actually not the only way to reach this variation. If you end up liking the lines with bishop b4 followed by a quick bishop c5, well, you may very well have a surprise weapon up your sleeve. Surprisingly, it's perfectly playable to capture the b4 pawn not with the bishop, but with the knight. This looks like an absolutely terrible move, and it has even been said in other coverage that this move drops the e5 pawn. Well, it's precisely this misunderstanding that makes knight b4 a dangerous weapon. White should continue to play in typical Evans Gambit style with c3, gaining a tempo against the knight, followed by transposing into the bishop c5 lines by playing d4, a line we're about to examine in a moment. But since knight b4 looks like such a terrible move, it's all too tempting to capture the e5 pawn. Not only does black give up a pawn, now f7 is under serious pressure. Looks can be deceiving as this is actually a serious mistake by white. It's important to never forget that by playing b4, this does open up the long dark squared diagonal, which may be good news for white's dark squared bishop, but on the other hand, this could completely backfire after queen f6, attacking the knight, x-raying the unprotected rook on a1. And let's not forget to mention threatening mate in 1. You know it's a bad sign when white's best move is to castle, simply hanging the knight. Because if white plays bishop takes f7, this is well met by king f8, when white's light-squared bishop is in jeopardy, especially because it's defended by a hanging knight. And once again, mate in 1 is still in the air. If white tries to fight back with d4, attacking the bishop while defending the knight, This completely blows up in white's face thanks to the tactical shot bishop takes d4, forking the knight and rook, when white's position is simply collapsing because capturing the bishop is a huge blunder, stumbling into a fork, attacking the king, rook, and most importantly, collecting the queen on the next move. Although the tricky knight takes b4 is definitely worth keeping in mind, white is able to force a transposition with c3, followed by d4. Let's see where the lines knight takes b4 and bishop takes b4 meet. After the far more popular bishop takes pawn, a key theme in the Evans Gambit is restricting black's dark-squared bishop, gaining time against this piece while preparing to build a strong central presence. White gains a tempo against the bishop with c3, and if the bishop decides to return to c5, we'll now cross paths with the variation knight takes b4, as white strikes in the center with the typical Evans Gambit shot d4, continuing to haunt the dark-squared bishop while fighting for central control. Since e5 is now attacked twice, black typically captures the d4 pawn. It's perfectly playable to recapture the pawn when black can play the more restrained bishop b6, or decide to attack the enemy king with bishop b4, provoking knight b to d2. But a more popular, as well as tricky reply is to simply castle. This is one of the reasons why the Evans Gambit is so dangerous. By move 7, white is already castled, enjoys active development and good central control. Meanwhile, black's king is still stranded in the center, and black is falling behind in development. And if black continues to capture every pawn offered by white, black is about to realize that all of these pawns were not a generous gift. When facing this gambit, black should try to focus on safely completing development and avoid capturing too many pawns, because with each pawn capture this helps accelerate white's already dangerous lead in development. By capturing the c3 pawn, this opens up the d-file for white's queen. Now white shouldn't play queen d5 immediately, attacking the unprotected bishop and f7 pawn, as this is well met by queen e7. But white can prepare this idea with the nice attraction tactic, bishop takes f7, temporarily sacrificing a piece in order to lure the enemy king to f7, which allows the double attack queen d5, attacking the enemy king while preparing to collect the bishop on the next move. White enjoys an excellent position as black must deal with the weakened king side and insecure king, precisely what black should try to avoid. After white castles, black may temporarily enjoy being up 2 extra pawns, but black should not grow too attached to this misleading material advantage. Although it is a healthy concept to accept white's initial pawn sacrifices, white does have a serious lead in development and is prepared to seize more central space with c takes d4. As is typical when facing gambits, one way to stabilize your position is to return some of the sacrificed material in order to support your central control and try to catch up on much needed development, instead of being blinded by materialism and capturing another pawn, allowing the tactical shot bishop takes f7. This is a good moment for black to play d6, supporting the center while opening up a path for the light-squared bishop. This allows white to regain one of the sacrificed pawns, gaining more space while establishing a powerful 2-pawn center and gaining a tempo against the enemy bishop. So understandably, black retreats the bishop to b6. White has no shortage of ideas. The committal pawn lunge d5 is an interesting idea, gaining more space but also opening up the scope for black's dark-squared bishop. By moving the pawn to d5, this also restricts white's light-squared bishop in the process. And although knight c to e7 is one idea, it's also perfectly reasonable to challenge this light-squared bishop with knight a5, an idea we'll revisit throughout the video. A more flexible way for white to play is to simply actively develop the knight, reaching a typical Evans Gambit position in which white has clear compensation for the pawn thanks to a healthy 2-pawn center, active minor pieces, not to mention a significant lead in development and a safe king. One thing that makes accepting the Evans Gambit so challenging for black is that white has fairly straightforward developing moves, but because black lags behind in development, these natural developing moves can be severely punished. Black would love to prioritize kingside development with a move such as knight f6, fighting for central control while desperately trying to evacuate the king from the center. But this turns out to be one move too late as white is able to blast open the center with e5, attacking the knight and preparing to rip open central lines with e takes d6. So after d takes e5, rather than immediately capturing the e5 pawn, what do you think matters the most in this position? Black's main goal in the Evans is to complete development and secure king's safety. And now that there's no longer a pawn on d6, this is a perfect moment to pounce on the a3 to f8 diagonal with bishop a3. This is a dream position in the Evans Gambit for white, and an absolute nightmare for black. If black decides to capture the pawn with the bishop, this is well met by queen b3, building a dangerous queen-bishop battery against the sensitive f7 pawn. And if black decides to play e takes d4, capturing another pawn and threatening white's knight, once again, white is able to take advantage of the space this pawn capture left behind, this time the open e-file with rook e1, attacking the enemy king. Black tries to guard the king with bishop e6, and although white's knight on c3 is hanging, white's incredibly active forces can simply ignore this threat and overwhelm black's defenses with knight g5, piling on the pressure against the pinned bishop. And if black captures the knight, instead of the automatic knight takes e6, a stronger continuation is capturing with the bishop, with the point that now there are two pieces attacking f7. Capturing the bishop would allow the crushing rook takes e6, attacking black's exposed king. And if black tries to relieve some pressure by exchanging queens, white calmly completes development with rook a takes d1, a picturesque Evans Gambit scenario. White sacrificed material to emphasize rapid, harmonious development, and when the dust settles, black's king remains stranded in the center. Black's position is completely hopeless. For example, if black tries to capture the bishop, this allows a forced mate after rook takes e6. The king is unable to move, so black is forced to immediately return the piece with knight e7. The rook continues to deal damage down the e-file, forcing the king to f8. Now that the e6 square is cleared for landing, white's knight enters the action with knight e6. When after king g8, white hunts down the enemy king with rook g7, delivering a nice mate. The natural knight f6 leads to disaster as white is able to blast open the center with e5. So what if black's knight accepts a more modest debut by moving to e7? This is a sensible looking move, but it also leads to disaster after knight g5, intensifying the pressure against f7 when there simply isn't a good defense. For example, if black decides to castle, this stumbles directly into the crushing shot queen h5, threatening mate as well as supporting knight takes f7, so black's position crumbles under the incredible pressure. Now before you get the impression that the Evans Gambit wins by force, and there's certainly no shortage of ways for black to lose the game before it even really gets started, black should respect, but by no means fear this opening. A key challenge for black in these lines is taking the time to understand the pitfalls that must be avoided, and knowing when and how to counter white's opening initiative. The interested viewer may explore bishop g4, activating a piece while pinning the knight to the queen. But an incredibly instructive resource you'll see throughout the Evans Gambit is to confront white's deadly light-squared bishop with knight a5. Moving the knight to the edge of the board may feel like a shallow beginner's move, but in truth this is a reasonable idea that has to be taken seriously as white. Of course, rather than moving this knight to the edge of the board, black would love to activate the other knight, but white's light-squared bishop is doing an excellent job applying pressure against black's king's side, so black simply doesn't have time to activate the knight on g8. This is the whole point behind knight a5, encouraging white to abandon this diagonal as black is more than willing to exchange the light-squared bishop. In order to avoid giving up this powerhouse piece for black's wayward knight on a5, a sensible choice is to centralize the bishop with bishop d3. Once again, knight f6 invites white to blast open the position with e5, but in addition to the possibility of bishop g4, black's other knight can make a modest as well as safe entrance into the game with knight e7. Now that e5 doesn't gain a tempo against black's knight on f6, black may simply capture the pawn, not fearing complications as white's light-squared bishop no longer adds pressure against the f7 pawn. Well, speaking about no longer adding pressure against the f7 pawn, this means that knight e7 is no longer refuted by knight g5, followed by a quick queen h5, adding pressure against f7 and threatening mate if black castles. This means that black is ready to safely castle, and black may also consider moving the knight to g6, eyeing some squares on the king's side, and later possibly preparing to strike against white's center with c5. Of course, white certainly enjoys compensation thanks to the central space advantage and active pieces, but black is very much in the fight with mutual chances for both sides. So far, we've focused on exploring bishop c5, as it does a great job demonstrating some typical themes in the Evans, but this is only the third most popular choice. A good alternative to explore is bishop e7, with the idea of meeting white's typical d4 central expansion with the now familiar idea knight a5, confronting white's dangerous light-squared bishop. Well, that being said, the most popular choice tested as well as approved at Grandmaster level is bishop a5. The bishop is now immune from additional harassment by white's pawns while keeping an eye on the e1 to a5 diagonal, x-raying the enemy king. This may suggest that white may want to avoid playing d4, pinning the c3 pawn to its own king. But if white decides to castle, this allows black a critical tempo to activate the knight, confronting white's center while preparing to castle. So in Evans Gambit style, white does not shy away from complications and immediately confronts black's center. When black is faced with a serious decision, it's still possible to capture white's pawn, taking advantage of the pinned c3 pawn at the cost of delaying the plan to help stabilize the center and complete development. The immediate queen b3 is met by queen e7, leading to interesting complications. But now that white has softened the e5 square, white can spend a tempo on castling, unpinning the c3 pawn, preparing to regain central control on the next move. We've already understood the point that black should not get blinded by materialism and neglect development for too long, and it turns out this position is no exception. Capturing yet another pawn is a serious mistake, as this allows white to build a dangerous initiative with queen b3, actively developing while threatening the f7 pawn. Defending the sensitive f7 pawn with queen f6 is well met by the energetic bishop g5, and if black decides to defend the pawn with queen e7, this sets the stage for a famous classical game. Bobby Fischer, commanding the white pieces, activated his knight with knight takes c3, which highlights another positive point behind moving the queen to b3 as it supports this knight move, increasing white's attacking potential in the process. Bobby Fischer absolutely crushed his opponent's rather casual approach to this dangerous opening. This is an incredibly inspiring game every potential Evans Gambit player should explore, and it's also instructive from black's point of view to better understand what not to do in the opening. Instead of grabbing another pawn on c3, black has no shortage of interesting options to explore. One idea is to play knight g to e7, preparing to meet the central pawn grab, or the more aggressive knight g5, with the well-timed central pawn strike d5, leading to incredible complications. And unlike the variation with the bishop on c5, knight f6 is surprisingly playable, compared to the bishop c5 variation where the bishop is chased back to b6, losing a critical tempo. In this case, black is ready to meet e5 with the powerful central counterstrike d5, provoking some serious complications that do not favor white. So it's a good idea for white to prepare e5 by first playing bishop a3, activating the bishop while preventing black from castling. Once again, black should not be blinded by materialism and grab the e4 pawn, as one strong reply is rook e1, pinning the knight to its stranded king in the center. Since black's king desperately wants to escape the center, it makes sense to play d6, supporting the center, activating the light-squared bishop, and of course blunting white's dark-squared bishop on a3. This line in the Evans Gambit requires tremendous energy from white, as casual play can lead to trouble. For example, if white just captures the pawn, this allows black to castle with a comfortable game. So white should prefer the energetic counterstrike e5, trying to force open the a3 to f8 diagonal for the bishop. So black should try to keep the position as closed as possible by centralizing the knight. If white plays rook e1, then black is ready to play d5, maintaining white's pawn on e5, which might create some involuntary shelter for black's king. And after white opens lines with e takes d6, black can calmly recapture the pawn, preparing to meet queen e2 with queen e7, or possibly even d5, once again producing sharp complications. But if white decides to play the tempting rook e1, we may also be tempted to react to this threat with d5, anchoring the knight while attacking the bishop. But in so doing, this opens up the a3 to f8 diagonal, and since there are no longer any pawns on the e-file, this may cause a problem for our stranded king. Instead of defending the knight directly, white will be in for quite a surprise after black prioritizes king's safety by castling. Although it appears the knight is simply hanging, black is prepared to reply with the powerful shot d5. It is true that black is temporarily down a piece in exposing the rook on f8, but this powerful central strike creates dangerous counterplay, forking the rook and bishop. This once again leads to razor-sharp complications that actually favor black. Indeed, white isn't the only player who can sacrifice material in the Evans Gambit. After white strikes in the center with d4, capturing the pawn is certainly a playable, if not somewhat chaotic line. A more stable choice is to decline the d4 pawn and simply focus on supporting the center with d6. Black is trying to avoid unnecessary complications while trying to complete development. If white decides to castle, which is perfectly playable of course, this does provide additional options for black, including bishop g4, improving the dark squared bishop with bishop b6, adding pressure against white's center in the process. And even knight f6 is perfectly playable. Once again, we see the continued theme of white trying to strike energetically before black is able to complete development, this time with queen b3, adding pressure against the f7 pawn. But black should not assume this is the only point behind this move, as a response such as queen f6, defending the f7 pawn completely overlooks another aspect of queen b3. This falls for the tactical trick e5, attacking the knight, with the point that once it moves out of the way, white is able to take advantage of the exposed king, forking the enemy king and bishop, simply winning a piece. Once we realize that queen b3 not only threatens the f7 pawn, it's also preparing the tactical trick d5, intending to win black's dark squared bishop. Black is able to defend against both threats with queen d7, defending the f7 pawn while providing shelter for the king on the e8 to a4 diagonal. This move does have the drawback of blocking the light squared bishop, but black does need to respect white's lead in development and accept some concessions in order to achieve a solid game. In response, white may decide to castle, when one good reply is bishop b6, adding pressure against white's center while clearing the a5 square for the knight, attacking the queen-bishop battery. That's definitely a great line to explore, and another instructive idea is capturing the pawn, which was played by none other than Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura. White's point is to meet the reasonable reply d takes e5 with the now familiar theme bishop a3, activating the dark squared bishop while restricting the enemy king. His opponent, former world champion Vishwanathan Anand, demonstrates another path by playing bishop b6. Notice that Anand is not afraid to return the sacrificed pawn, improving the scope of his dark squared bishop while clearing the a5 square for his knight. White may decide to discourage this plan by pinning the knight to its queen with bishop b5, but after black challenges this bishop with a6, and the bishop maintains pressure on that diagonal with bishop a4, black may decide to support the knight with knight g to e7, clearing the path for kingside castling. Definitely an interesting idea worth exploring. But in this particular game, Hikaru decided to play a4, seizing more queenside space and demonstrating that white doesn't have to be afraid of giving up the beloved light-squared bishop, which is precisely what happened in the game after knight a5, forking the queen and bishop, so white retreated the queen to a2. When white was ready to exchange the light-squared bishop for black's knight, Vishy continued by activating his knight with knight e7, preparing to castle kingside. If white plays a5, then black is ready to play bishop c5, enjoying protection from the d6 pawn. So Hikaru decided to capture the d6 pawn, when Vishy decided to recapture with the pawn. This does isolate the d6 pawn, but it does an excellent job defending the e5 and c5 squares, and opening up the c-file for future development. As we can see, both sides have made some structural concessions to reach this imbalanced position, allowing both sides to have reasons to look to the future with optimism. White enjoys more central and queenside space, as well as open lines on the d and b files. Notice that the isolated d6 pawn may become a target for white's pieces. Black, on the other hand, enjoys the bishop pair, a slightly less compromised pawn structure, as white's queenside pawns may need attention in the future. This suggests there are plenty of opportunities for both sides to outplay the opponent, with mutual chances to explore. We've covered quite a bit of ground in the Evans Gambit, introducing some of the key plans for both sides in this rich gambit opening. If some of these complications made your head spin, don't worry, you're certainly not alone. If you're more interested in coexisting with the Evans Gambit and not trying to refute it, simply satisfied with reaching a playable middle game with as little drama as possible, then you may want to explore the low-maintenance reply bishop b6. declining the gambit and seeking more solid, straightforward play. If allowed, Black's default game plan may be a6, opening a window for your dark squared bishop, supporting the center with d6, as well as knight f6 and castle kingside, a default strategy not unlike some of the slower lines in the Italian game. On the other hand, if white decides to grab more queenside space, threatening to hunt down the dark squared bishop, this is well met by the calm reply a6, supporting the b5 square while opening up the a7 square for the dark squared bishop if necessary. In reply, white may consider ideas such as knight c3, preparing to centralize the knight and harass the dark squared bishop from d5, or white may consider the more solid approach c3, shoring up the queenside pawn structure, claiming a space advantage with the slower paced type of game. Well, at least compared to the sharper Evans Gambit accepted. Although Black seeks a more peaceful life by declining the gambit, you still need to know some concrete details. Some players may be discouraged from playing the Evans Gambit declined because it appears white is winning a pawn after b5. Although this premature pawn lunge should not favor white, Black cannot relax and must play energetically. Objectively speaking, the strongest reply is knight a5, confronting the light-squared bishop. If the bishop decides to vacate the a2 to g8 diagonal with a move such as bishop e2, Black can decide to play solidly with knight f6 and castling kingside. And Black may also consider the energetic d5 pawn break, as well as c6, adding pressure against white's queenside. So if the bishop retreats, there are no shortage of interesting ideas to explore. But the main question is what happens if white captures the e5 pawn, attacking f7 in the process. Queen f6 and queen g5 can provoke incredible complications, not exactly what Black had in mind with the Evans Gambit declined. Black's most solid reply is to simply play knight h6, defending the f7 pawn with the threat of bishop d4 in the air, forking the knight and rook. White is under incredible pressure and can easily go astray. In order to survive, white has to know the far from obvious reply, bishop e2, allowing Black to centralize the bishop, exploiting the weaknesses on the long diagonal, when white has to use the newly vacated c4 square for the knight, counterattacking Black's knight and preparing c3 if allowed. The interested viewer is encouraged to explore these complications that ultimately should prove favorable for Black. But if complications are precisely what you're trying to avoid, let's look at another way to deal with white's attempt to win a pawn. Against this premature pawn lunge, knight a5 is objectively the best response, but it does require some precise knowledge. But if you want to avoid these complications and set a trap for your opponent, you can play the less accurate, but reasonable enough reply knight d4. This line isn't as reliable for Black as white can simply trade knights, preparing to meet bishop takes knight with c3, followed by typical central expansion. As long as you're willing to accept a somewhat cramped, but certainly playable game, then this path is worth considering. But the main point behind knight d4 is to set a trap. If white tries to win the pawn, this is a serious blunder, as not only can Black sacrifice a pawn with d5, opening up the light-squared bishop before playing queen g5, the immediate queen g5 is also a crushing resource, counterattacking white's knight and unprotected g2 pawn. And if white tries to win the rook with knight takes f7, forking the queen and rook, white is in for a big surprise after queen takes g2, counterattacking the rook on h1, followed by capturing the pawn on e4. And if white tries to defend the rook with rook f1, white's king is now entombed in the center, allowing the powerful shot queen takes e4, attacking the enemy king when white is forced to surrender the queen, and with it, a completely losing position. Because if white tries to block with the bishop, this allows the beautiful shot knight f3, taking advantage of the pinned bishop, delivering a smothered mate. The Evans Gambit is one of white's most respected gambits available. It's been played by some of the best players in the world, including former world champion Garry Kasparov, and it's also a popular opening at amateur level, and for good reason. We explored some of white's dangerous attacking ideas, as well as various strategies for Black to hold the balance and challenge the Evans Gambit. Whether you're sacrificing the b-pawn seeking your own evergreen attacking game, or simply concentrating on weathering the storm and seeking counter chances as Black, you will certainly have no shortage of exciting moments in the